I noticed that in the write-ups about my annual letter, not one single journalist wrote about share-based compensation. I'll leave you to make your own conclusions on what that means about financial journalism. But I just want to touch upon this because I think it is an important issue. And I think it's one we may well see a lot more of, particularly given what's happening in the tech sector now. It's become an increasingly important part of tech companies' expenses in recent times. Of the 75 companies in the S&P Dow Jones technology sector, basically, if you look at the amount of share-based compensation expense that they've had in paying people with shares, not cash, it's gone from 2.2% of revenues a decade ago to 4.1% at the end of 2021. Doesn't sound like a lot, does it? But try and bear in mind that on average their revenues quintupled during this period. So the absolute numbers here are pretty darn big. Amongst those 75 companies, 45 of them have removed share-based compensation from a non-GAAP version of earnings that they provide to us, their operating earnings and their earnings per share. When I say removed, what that means is at the moment, the share-based compensation under GAAP is, unsurprisingly, a deduction from your profits from your revenues before you report your profits, because it's an expense. What they do is they take that out, they add it back, so it doesn't exist as an expense. That's kind of, I mean, I could almost stop there in terms of what my objections are, but I won't stop there. I'll go on a bit. Just to give you a number on that, in 2021, that was $26 billion of expenses that were excluded from the profit and loss accounts of these 45 companies. So it's about $600 million per company, or as we call it, a lot, basically. I think that's probably something they shouldn't be doing, fairly obviously. That's why I've basically flagged this. What do they say about it? They say, oh, well, we take it out because it's a non-cash expense. Stop. There are plenty of items in the P&L account that are non-cash. Depreciation and amortization are non-cash, right? Deferred revenues, it's a non-cash item, right? But, you know, taking it out and saying, oh, we take it out is just not right. If you want to measure a company's cash flows, you should be looking in the cash flow statement, not in a doctored P&L statement where you take out a number that you'd really like to see removed for share-based compensation. They say the calculation of the expense requires valuation methodologies because you've got to value the shares that you're giving out in share-based compensation. And these are difficult because they require estimates outside the company's control. There are plenty of things in the P&L account which require estimates, which are difficult to estimate, and which are outside company's control. This is by no means new. They say it involves double counting because you have the expense and the number of shares is increased, and so it affects the EPS. No, I'm afraid there are plenty of items which are in the profit and loss account and the balance sheet and gravitate between the two over time, or have a circular effect between the two. And also, this is only something that affects earnings per share. It doesn't affect actual operating profit numbers. And they say everybody does it. Well, does everybody do it? No, they don't, actually. Here's Microsoft versus Intuit. And you see there's Microsoft, which doesn't make any adjustment for share-based compensation, even though it uses it. And by the way, I've got no problem with paying people in shares. It can obviously be beneficial in terms of aligning interests. Microsoft, when we did this calculation at the end of the year, was on GAAP earnings multiple of 25 times. Intuit, which makes this adjustment and reports non-GAAP earnings, was on 28 times earnings. Not bad, pretty comparable with Microsoft, I would say. And the analysts have swallowed hook, line, and sinker these non-GAAP earnings because that's what it shows you on Bloomberg. If you make the adjustment to put the share-based compensation debit back into the profit and loss account and show GAAP earnings, it's on 44 times. Are we really happy with Intuit on 75% higher earnings multiple than Microsoft? Not entirely. And then, as I say, you might say, well, Terry, that kind of comes as a great shock. I mean, it didn't come as a great shock. What did come as a shock is that the management actually believe that that's something you should start basing things like $12 billion acquisitions on. That was enough to send us over the edge, I'm afraid. Ironically, the share-based compensation measures are one of these very rare things. I can't think of another one which distort not only the profit and loss account, but even the cash flow, which is what we normally rely upon. So if you look at our friends over at Microsoft, you'll see that they are rated on free cash flow yield at about 3.5% on their GAAP earnings and GAAP cash flow. If you take the cash flow, the share-based compensation in the cash flow is an operating item. It's clearly not an operating item because it's distorting the operating cash flows of the company. If we take it out, Microsoft goes to a 3.1% free cash flow. It's a little bit more expensive. But if you do it in Intuit, it takes them from a 3.5% comparable free cash flow today. It's the same as Microsoft, good business. It takes you to a much, much more expensive business, 2.2%. And I think that's it, Conrad. I think we've through the site. Yeah, there we are. There we go. Thank you very much. I'll